All right, hello everybody. Welcome back. So we are moving on to Module 2. So this week we're going to be focusing on looking at the level of biology that's called ecology. And specifically, we're going to be understanding a lot of the vocabulary that ecologists use to describe how they're studying things, what they're studying, and critically the interactions between organisms and their environment. So as always, we're going to start off this lecture with a current study that's happening in biology, looking at Dr. Castillo's work and the association with canine rabies and ecological corridors in Arequipa, Peru. So go ahead and pause this lecture for a minute and take a look at this image. Okay, so I hope that you've paused. And what we're going to be looking at is this outbreak of rabies that happened in the southern region of Peru. So these areas that are highlighted here are areas where we've seen an outbreak of rabies, of dog rabies in Arequipa and Puno in southern Peru. So Dr. Castillo's work has been looking at rabid dogs in one major city in Arequipa, and specifically their spatial and temporal distributions. So when we go into this first figure here, we see that that these red dots are clearly where rabid dogs have been located. And then you can see these gray lines indicate water channels, and then a large river, and then each of these tiny gray dots is a house. And so what Dr. Castillo was trying to observe was, as these dogs become infected, where are they located? And is there a potential to understand disease distribution dynamics by looking at where these rabid dogs were in this larger city? And you can see that these rabid dogs tend to cluster along these river channels, these dry riverbeds. And it turns out that dogs were using these dry riverbeds as essentially thoroughfares throughout the city. And they were coming in contact with each other in large groups, and thus exacerbating an outbreak of canine rabies. And so critically, what Dr. Castillo was looking at how rabies is interacting with the dog population, and then how that dog population is interacting with the environment. So this type of study, where we're looking at interactions between organisms, in this case a virus and dogs, and then dogs and the physical environment, this is a great example of an ecological study. So as always, we want to think through some of these driving questions. And in this lecture, we're going to primarily be looking at this first one, which is really, what is ecology and what do ecologists study? These second two questions we're going to get to in the next module lecture. But really, what do ecologists study? How do they study? And what levels of ecology do these biologists look at? So ecology is ultimately the study of interactions among organisms, between organisms, and then their non-living environment. So it's looking how different individuals might interact with it among themselves, among them and other species, and how the environment might shape those interactions. And then critically, how all of these interactions come together to keep an ecosystem thriving or not thriving. So your book gives a fantastic example of moose and wolves on this specific island in Alaska. Ecologists, we love islands because it's essentially an opportunity to study an environment in isolation. We're able to look specifically at the wolf population, how that's impacting the moose population, without either the moose or the wolf leaving. Because again, We're on an island. So it's a great system in which we can really look specifically at how these populations interact and how they interact with the environment. So that's what the example that was given in your book as sort of our case study that we're going to be going through throughout this lecture. Ultimately, ecology is the study of levels. So we saw that there were those 4 levels that we saw previously, but it's not just a study of like individual observation. So like you might think of an ecologist as going out and watching a cheetah for hours on end. But really what ecologists do is it's a science that's integral for both conservation, understanding environmental dynamics, modeling where populations go or might not go, and also disease dynamics. And so that's something that my colleague, Dr. Castillo, and myself are interested in as disease ecologists. So this is just an example of thinking about these different levels and how a disease ecologist might explore these different levels. So here in this figure, we can see that there might be some disease that's circulating in wild animal hosts. And then there's potential for wild animal, whatever virus, for example, is circulating in these hosts might spill over into a domestic population of animals. And that might in turn spill over into humans. Additionally, the spillover event could just skip domestic animals altogether and spill directly over into humans, as we saw with coronavirus. We saw what most likely was a bat or a pangolin. We saw spillover of that virus directly into humans. But if, for example, we have a rapid response and are able to control a population, for example, if we're controlling dog rabies in a population, we can potentially intervene and have the chance to decrease human infection. We might also, for example, if we're monitoring diseases in the bat population, we might be able to say, oh, we have an unnaturally high spike of this virus in a bat population. We need to be very careful and potentially cull populations of bats. We might, again, be able to prevent that disease from spilling over into humans or into the domestic population. So that's just an example of how a disease ecologist might think of these different studies and different levels of study and integration. So let's start with our base level, an individual level. So understanding how an individual organism fares in its surroundings. So a great example of this might be the Nepalese rhinoceros, which is a very endangered species. There are only about 500 left in the wild currently. And there are studies of ecologists that basically observe one individual rhinoceros, understanding its behavior, and by understanding these individuals' singular behaviors, they might be able to think, okay, this animal is doing much better in this type of environment. We need to think through how we might be able to then conserve those environments. To a much more base of understanding the dynamics of where your cat goes at night. So there's been great actual ecological studies where you attach a GPS unit to a cat and understand where it goes at night, what it's feeding on. And from there, we can start to make extrapolations of how individual cats might be impacting an ecosystem. Moving up, we can start to think about population ecology. So population looking at a group of individuals. So in the example given in your book, we were looking at a population of wolves and how those circulate. And if we think back to the Nepalese rhinoceros, we can start looking, instead of at these individual levels, we can start to look at the rhinoceros population as a whole and the percent of calves that are born during each month. We can start to say, oh, okay, it looks like there are more calves born in January and August. That must be when the breeding season is. We need to make sure that we can see if we can get male and female rhinoceroses together at the right time so that their breeding cycling is correct. So that might be a question that a population level ecologist might ask. Next, we can start to look at community level ecologists. So in your book, we are looking at communities of wolves and moose, or ticks that infest the moose, and how the moose then feed on trees, and how all those different communities interact. But we can also think about community ecology on a microscopic level. So this is a great study by Dr. Noah Feiner that's looking at the populations of bacteria and other earthworms and other microbiota within soils in different landscapes. So we can see what the composition of soil looks like in a tropical forest versus a desert. So this is another type of community ecology question. Lastly, we can start to think of the ecosystem levels, and you're going to watch a great example of understanding how sea otters impact an ecosystem. But just to give you a taste of what that might look like, so sea otters primarily eat sea urchin. They're one of the only predators that do so. And so when sea otters are in the presence of these kelp forests eating sea urchins, the kelp is able to flourish. Without sea otters, the sea urchins take over and kelp isn't able to survive. And what's really interesting about kelp is helping diminish our levels of carbon in the atmosphere by a lot. And so this great study looking at understanding kelp forest dynamics, you can see that kelp is essentially able to capture a large amount of carbon, and rather than releasing that carbon back into the atmosphere once it dies, it circles to the bottom of the ocean, and that carbon isn't then dispersed into the atmosphere. So we can actually see how sea otters are changing the carbon cycle in the planet. So that's an example of an ecosystem level type of ecology. And so throughout these next few modules, we're going to be exploring each of these levels more specifically and understanding how ecologists think through questions at each of those levels. All right, thanks so much. See you soon.